Chapter 4 Schooled Fish Out of Water. By the fall of 1920, an entire generation infected with the spirit of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, had returned from the battlefields of Europe. Used to speed, excitement, and living on the edge, they found it impossible to settle down into the humdrum routine of American life as if nothing had changed. Everything had changed. They were sick and tired of heroic efforts, disillusioned by war, and cynical about peace. They wanted fun and freedom and release from those stodgy pre-war morals and ideas, awash in rebellion. They pursued both pleasure and profit recklessly. They were uninhibited and emancipated. The whole country, declared novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald, was going hedonistic. Thus, the Roaring Twenties was born, age of jazz babies and flappers, bootleg whiskey and true crime magazines, and at the University of Wisconsin, students were flinging themselves into the new decade with abandon. Female students shortened both their hair and their hemlines, and cigarettes became their new diet fad. Male students donned raccoon coats and carried around ukuleles in hopes of wooing these newly emancipated girls. To the shock of their elders, they sipped gin, now illegal with the passage of the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in January 1920, from hip flasks, sat in parked automobiles for petting parties, stayed up into the wee hours, and gleefully pushed each other into Lake Mendota. Into this world rode Charles Lindbergh. He did not fit in. Shy and clean-shaven, he was remarkably wholesome. He didn't drink or smoke. He didn't touch caffeine, not even Coca-Cola, and he cared nothing for fashionable clothes. He'd never learned to dance or been on a date. He also lived with his mother. Incredibly, Evangeline had followed her son to college, renting a 2-bedroom apartment close to campus. She went about keeping house for the 18-year-old freshman. Charles didn't mind being with his mother was better than living with strangers in a dorm. Charles steered clear of most people. He found the other students childish and their activities pointless. It wasn't long before his classmates left him as alone as he seemed to want to be. They judged him different and odd, a boy who went home every night to have dinner with his mother. Things were no better in the classroom. Unable to concentrate, he daydreamed and doodled and took long hikes beside the lake instead of completing assignments. Despite his mother's help, she wrote his papers. His grades were poor. Why should one spend hours of life on formulae, semicolons, and our crazy English spelling? He asked himself. I don't believe God made man to fiddle with pencil marks on a paper. He gave him earth and air to feel, and now even wings to fly. Charles had followed newspaper accounts of aerial combat during the war, and he'd briefly considered joining the army in hopes of training to be a pilot. Now his interest in flying and his frustration over college coalesced. In late fall 1921, he wrote to a handful of flight schools. No matter that he'd never even gotten close to a plane, much less flown in one, he was certain he could be a pilot. Soon he was poring over the flight school's pamphlets. This was the kind of learning he knew he would like. Hands-on instruction in the air and practical lessons on all aspects of airplane mechanics. The 19-year-old was most impressed by a program offered by the Nebraska Aircraft Corporation in Lincoln. Courses began the first week of April, and the literature urged potential students to apply early since enrollment was limited. Should he apply? His parents, he knew, would be dead set against his quitting school. The university made the decision for him. Midway through his sophomore year, after failing mathematics, physics, and mechanical design, he was expelled. No reasonable parent in 1922 would have wanted his or her child to become a pilot. Civilian aviation in those days was perilous and completely unregulated by the government. Anyone could buy a plane in any condition and take up paying customers. These planes were almost all former warplanes that had been sold off by the government. Small and unstable, the wood and fabric crates held just one or two passengers, if the passengers didn't weigh too much. Since anyone with a plane, skilled or unskilled, could take to the sky, accidents were common. It was claimed that the average pilot could expect to fly just 900 hours before suffering a fatal crash. No wonder the majority of Americans thought airplanes were wildly unsafe. Flying was also considered slightly seedy. At that time, there were no commercial airlines in the United States. Not a not a single company had yet to move people and cargo by air. Only the United States Postal Service used airplanes, but in a very limited capacity. Without airlines to employ them, pilots took whatever work they could find, giving rides at county fairs, dragging advertising banners across the sky, and performing spectator thrilling aerial stunts. In good weather months, these men and women too crisscrossed the country, vagabonding in the air, as one pilot put it. In constant search of a job. Most just barely managed to eke out an existence. Her son's decision disappointed Evangeline, but she hid her emotions. "All right," she finally said. "If you really want to fly, that's what you should do." She paused before adding, "You must lead your own life. I mustn't hold you back. Only I can't see the time when we'll be together much again." Evangeline would eventually take a teaching job in Detroit, and Charles would soar into history. But first, he had to learn to fly. Above, Charles stood in the big, half-open door and blinked. What a sight! Airplanes, a half-dozen, lined the Nebraska Aircraft Corporation's factory floor. The surplus Army training planes, now converted for civilian use, that Charles gazed at were Lincoln Standard turnabouts, biplanes with forward mounted propellers. They were powered by a 150 horsepower engine that could reach a speed of 90 miles per hour. Charles didn't know any of this yet. This was the first time he'd been close enough to an airplane to touch it. His fingers stroked wooden struts and trailed down slender wires. His nostrils filled with the acrid odor of acetate. Ray Page, the company president, gave the gangly 20-year-old the once-over. What did the kid want? Charles explained that he'd come to enroll in the flying school. Page didn't know about any flying school. He'd bought the company just a month earlier, and the previous owners hadn't said a word about it, probably because there'd never been one. Genuine flying schools were rare in 1922. Why train people for a career in which there were no jobs? The literature sent to Charles had been nothing more than a come on to lure potential airplane buyers. Still, there were plenty of pilots and mechanics around who could show the kid the ropes. Was Charles willing to pay? Charles handed over a check for $500, money he'd saved from his farming days. It was a princely sum for a scraping by aviator. "Welcome to school," announced Page. Right away, he put his one and only student to work. That first week, Charles took apart an engine and learned how to waterproof wings with a special varnish aviators called dope. He became proficient at straining fuel into a plane's tank and hooking up rudders. He was learning airplanes inside and out, and he marveled at all of it. Only a week later, on April 9th, 1922, Charles climbed into the front cockpit of a newly converted Liberty biplane for his first airplane ride. With his goggles strapped on and a leather helmet on his head, he turned to look at the pilot in the rear cockpit. "Contact!" hollered the pilot. The engine coughed, then caught with a roar. The wings trembled. The propeller blade became a blur. Then the plane moved forward, bumping over rough ground, going faster and faster. "Now!" exclaimed Charles. "The ground recedes. We're resting on the air. Up, past riggers and mechanics, over treetops, across a ravine, like a hawk." He felt weightless, transformed, above. "I lose all conscious connection with the past," said Charles. "I live only in the moment, in this strange, unmortal space, crowded with beauty, pierced with danger." Too soon the plane descended. The engine sputtered, and with a shudder, everything came to a stop. Charles felt overwhelmed with sadness. He didn't want to be on the ground. He wanted to be part of the clouds and sky, soaring through blue forever and ever. Forever and forever. Biff and Slim. While Charles made up the school's entire student body, Ira Biffle had been appointed by Ray Page to be its entire faculty. With a weather-worn face and a propensity for colorful cursing, Biff, as he was called, had trained pilots in the war. But after seeing a friend die in a plane crash, he'd lost his desire to fly. Time and again on clear blue mornings, Charles rode his motorcycle out to the airfield. He expected to be taken up, but most times Biff didn't show. When he did, he was full of excuses for not going up. "The air's too turbulent at midday, Slim," he'd say, using Charles's new nickname. "Meet me at the flying field when it smooths out this afternoon." Or, "Slim, it was just too rough. Let's try at sunrise tomorrow. That's the smoothest time of day." Charles didn't get into the air occasionally, but occasionally some Charles did get into the air occasionally, sometimes even managing to make a half dozen takeoffs and landings before Biff called it a day. Charles's quick reflexes and exceptional mechanical aptitude made him a natural pilot. In May, after just 8 hours of flying time, Biff decided Charles was ready to solo. "You can get up and down all right," the instructor said. He paused. "As long as the air's not too rough." It was a lukewarm endorsement. Still, soloing was all that stood between Charles and his flying certificate. And he wanted that certificate, no matter how meaningless it was to the rest of the aviation world. There was just one problem. He couldn't take a plane up by himself without Ray Page's permission, and Page wasn't giving in. What if the kid cracked up, damaged, or crashed, wrecked the plane? Page wasn't about to risk his expensive machine on a beginner. Charles considered his options. Sure, he hated not soloing, but even if he did solo, there wouldn't be a pilot job waiting for him. He was still a novice. People weren't going to trust their lives or machines to him. If he wanted a career in flying, he was going to have to get in lots more hours in the air any way he could.